This episode, we are going to be talking about why autistic people are less likely to identify as Christian. And I thought I'd start it off by talking about something completely different, and that's coin collecting. Have you ever engaged in the coin collecting hobby or a similar hobby of collecting artifacts and stuff like that?
I was a collector of many a shiny rock I would see around. I lived and grew up near a river that deposited quite a lot of white pebbles that had quartz, elements of quartz in them. And I used to love collecting those, but I would collect rocks. For a solid 4 years, I just collected interesting looking rocks.
Have you ever been to like a rock collecting convention or a place where people are dealing in rock collecting related wares?
It's funny you'd ask that very recently. And very recently I did and came to a bit of a revelation. So I went to a gemstones and fossils convention. And okay, it was so I love crystals because they are shiny rocks, but I'm not into the more witchy, esoteric side of that world. I like crystals because they're pretty. Amethysts, quartz, tiger's eye, all that sort of thing. They're very pretty. And it's difficult to find conventions that sell these wares that aren't run by esoteric groups. So I recently went to one that was a gemstones and fossils exhibition, and I found that it was very clear that a couple of things. One, these crystal shops are it's very much a female dominated industry. It is very much a girl's world running these crystal shops, be it the more esoteric side or just the look shiny pretty rocks. And the other realization I came to was that pretty much every single gemstones and crystals shopkeeper I spoke to at this convention clearly autistic. These were women who loved talking about the history of the uses of different gemstones, especially like lapis lazuli and and amethyst and quartz, and be it historical or spiritual, because again, some of these women were still into that more esoteric side, new age side of things. And any of these stalls that were both fossil and crystal involved were usually husband and wife team, and every single time it was a fossil husband and a crystal wife. And it was and again a clear neurodivergence going on with the both of them. The men would tell me how they loved collecting fossils from the age of 3, and it's been a lifelong passion. And it was a very similar thing with the crystal wives. They'd been collecting since they were usually around 5 or 6, because they were a bit old enough to have their own pocket money and go into these stores that would sell them. And it was revelatory, I must admit, and it's not a place you'd expect to see such a high concentration of autistic people, especially autistic women. And I would suspect a lot of these women would not know that they were autistic, but they certainly ticked off the criteria in my experience there. And I'll be honest, it was lovely. It's great to see people be that enthusiastic and passionate about their passions and hobbies.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. You probably would not be surprised to learn that is virtually every collection based hobby, like coin collecting, stamp collecting, artifact collecting. It's just filled with autistics. And I bring this up because I don't think anyone in the research community ever stops to ask the question, why is it that so many autistic people are like into collecting fiat currency or something like that? Sometimes they might ask that, or why aren't these autistic people in a nightclub? It's just assumed that it's, yeah, of course autistic people are into these hobbies. But one thing that I think is important to realize is, contrasting to what we were saying last episode about a common autistic sentiment about Christianity, is that it's a religion for neurotypicals by neurotypicals. Coin collecting, or just collecting rocks, for example, is very much the opposite. It is very much a hobby built by autistics for other autistics. And if you just look at the types of activities that they do, what do you do at a rock convention? You bring your rocks and you show other people your rocks and you talk about your rocks. And people come to you and ask you about your rocks and then you talk about them. Or you arrange your collections and you show other people your collections. And like all of the socializing is built around like autistic norms around socializing. And basically everything at those conventions, save for a few things, sometimes they can be a little more sensorily overwhelming than some autistic people can deal with. But in general, these places are, as you observed, heavily feature the neurodivergent community. And I don't think it's just because autistic people have a natural predisposition to want to collect and organize things, although I'm sure that is a component to it. I think a lot of it is, let's say you're a autistic person who's really into collecting rocks or fossils or coins or what have you. You start doing it, and then you go about your life, and your life is quite hard. Being an autistic person is not the easiest thing in the world, but then you go to these places and it's like, all these people get me, all these people understand me, all these people are doing the same types of things I like to do in the way that I like to do them. The social activities are all geared to my preferences, and so they just stick to the hobby. And it's really not surprising that you get so many people there, because I think once autistic people find those communities, they want to stay in those communities. And I think the best way to explain the phenomena of why autistic people are less likely to participate in Christianity is because Christianity can often be the inverse of a coin collecting convention or something like that. So we're going to talk about that this episode. We're going to talk about why it's often the inverse. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to prove that autistic people are less likely to be Christian, because sometimes people really want me to show that. And so we'll go through that. And then we'll talk a little bit about why. I think I'll start this episode off just talking a little bit about the stereotype of autistic people and religion that's commonly held by most people. When I was a younger man, I used to sign up for every autism study that I could find. I was near several universities, and like the largest Canadian children's hospital was near where I was, and they were constantly doing autism studies and they needed good candidates. And I was told I'm a very good candidate for these studies. So I did like fMRI imaging and all these types of things. And I saw researchers quite regularly, and I had talked to some of them. I remember, so this was maybe in 2020, I was talking to one of them when I had signed up for something, and they had me fill out a form, and I filled out that form, and it had a lot of things about my volunteer time and my social circles and things like that. And they were quite surprised, and they're like, wow, you have a pretty extensive set of social circles and stuff. And I said, well, yeah, it's all church related. And they said, oh, are you a Christian? And I said, yep. They said, oh, I just assumed you were an atheist because you were autistic. And I thought that was a little funny. So I asked them why, and they were just like, I do autism research, and you guys just seem like the type to not be religious. And it's, to be fair, like, I've talked to a lot of autistic people, and if you were unfortunate enough, as I was, to be in a lot of online new atheist communities, I was in them from like 2012 to probably 17-ish. For whatever sins I've committed, I paid penance in the Sam Harris group. So I was a big fan of Sam Harris and all this stuff. Yeah, I know, cringe. But yeah, that is the truth. But you find in those communities a lot of people like the kind of Reddit atheist. You find a lot of them in those communities, and it's a stereotype. And a lot of times you will find that those Reddit atheists are also autistic. There is an overlap. While it's not a one-to-one, it is an overrepresentation of autistic people. in those communities. I know because I've surveyed them. And it's also really funny to look at a lot of new atheist YouTubers and just look at where they are now and see how many of them have got an autism diagnosis. And it's like, it's not an insignificant portion of them. The stereotype is they're very pedantic, hyper-logical, very focused on like the rules of debate and technicalities and logical fallacies and like, did you follow the right rule in this thing, or like you've triggered this trap card or whatever. That's an appeal to authority. You can't do that.
Yes. They'll bring it up.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm bringing this up because when most people think about autistic people, I have found if they don't have actual experience with autistic people, they think of Reddit atheists. And yeah, so a lot of times, even like this particular autism researcher, they were surprised because that I was a Christian. Mostly, I think, because they spent the majority of their time talking with male college students. And a lot of formerly religious autistic men in their college years are going through what is sometimes referred to as the cage stage, where the joke is that you should just be locked in a cage at that point because you're going to say a lot of very stupid stuff. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just stating as just in general, there is a stereotype that autistic people are more likely to be atheists than new atheists, and there is data to back that up. But even going back to 2010, there's a pretty prominent person in the autism community. He was like one of the earliest people to publish an autobiography. His name is John Elder Robison, and he wrote a bunch of books. So like Temple Grandin, he was in like that era of autism advocacy.
I do recall that time. Yeah, that sort of early 2010s. Yeah, him and Temple Grandin very much were leading that charge of personal experience sharing.
Yes. And like to their credit, I think they did a lot to help with public perceptions of autism. And for whatever faults that they had, I think they did the best with what they had at the time. I think they did a positive service for the autism community in general. I know some people get mad because they didn't use all the right language or say all the right things or do all that, but I don't know. I have a fairly positive opinion of them.
Yeah, and it's important. It is important to keep in mind they are products of their time as well. It's not to excuse anything problematic. It's just to say that to just understand the context if you go into any of their works. Just to take that into consideration, there are some limitations based on the time period they came from, and the time period they were speaking was quite different to today's landscape.
Yeah. And so in 2010, he wrote a blog post about his own discussion with an autism researcher who asked, why do you think Asperger's people tend to be atheist? That was the title of the blog. And this was his response.
First of all, I had no idea whether or not her premise was even true. Did Asperger people tend to be atheists? I turned the question back to her, and she told me about studies she'd done exploring the religious views of a large number of people on the spectrum. Within the sample she had interviewed, the majority tend to have what she saw as atheist views. Since that time, I have conducted an informal poll in the course of my travels, and I have to say my numbers look similar to hers, but I don't claim to understand the why of it. After discussing that peculiar observation some more, we both wondered if the people's views were truly atheist or really anti-organized church. The more I listened to Catherine, the more I felt it was the latter case. I thought Asperger people might shy away from organized churches because their threat and dogma ran against our logical grain.
Basically, I think his intuitions on this are, I think the view of reality is a lot more complicated, but I think what he's observing from his travels is often true. Autistic people aren't really big into the organized church. That being said, some are really into the organized church, but in their own autistic way. I'll just say that. I think his intuition is mostly what I'm trying to get here, is that he's like, yeah, I think autistic people are less likely to be Christian, or at least more likely to be atheist. And I just think that is the general perception. And also, when you look in media, whenever you see a TV show and the person is a typecast autistic person, they're never religious. I can't think of one example.
I
Like
can.
in every case, they're explicitly.
Yeah, but it was it.
Please share.
Yeah, he wasn't. So one of the, I would say, Abed from Community is one of the few positive depictions of
Yes.
autism spectrum out there, and it was it was purely by accident. The writer Dan Harmon had not yet been diagnosed when he wrote this character. And for anyone who hasn't seen Community, it's an ensemble comedy that has 3 brilliant seasons, and then the rest of it you can take it or leave it. My personal, but yeah,
Yep.
it's, and one of the main characters of the ensemble is a character called Abed. He's a half Polish, half Arabic student who is raised mostly by his single father, and he does make reference to the fact that he is religiously Muslim, but he isn't really shown practicing all that much. So he would be more culturally Muslim. His father also is not shown as particularly religious, and there's a few funny moments where they break stereotypes of Arabic speaking men with his father. Like his father is very all for women being independent, and his father models for him a quite a healthy expression of sexuality, even though Abed's own inclinations are up in the air. And in terms of the strictness of adherence, it does seem that, yeah, there's this concept that they believe in God, but there's an openness and a tolerance to other religious practices. Because Abed is half Polish, he does celebrate the cultural side of Christmas. And in fact, there's a whole Christmas special that revolves around his love of Christmas. But yeah, as far as any other representation goes, I think so far he's the only one that's described as having any kind of religion. But even so, yeah, he's not really shown as much of a practitioner, just more someone who just assents to an idea
Yeah.
of God.
Yeah, and I think that's, yeah, when you said Abed, I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. That is true. But yeah, like you said, he isn't portrayed as devout or practicing or any of those sort of connotations. And yeah, I just think in general, when you look at the stereotype of autistic, they're generally not religious or not seen as very religious. The only exceptions to that might be if there was a show that focused strictly on only religious people, maybe there would be one in there, but I don't know. I haven't seen it. So I do a lot of presentations and I talk about my research that I've been doing to lots of various audiences. And especially when I go to universities and things like that, I get asked, so are autistic people less likely to be religious than their non-autistic counterparts? And I'm not going to lie, I hate this question. I think it sucks. It is extremely vague. And are autistic people less likely to be religious? There are a million different ways that you can be religious. And what being religious means encompasses so many different types of human expression that it's just like, do autistic people like soup? It's like, maybe, like, sure. It's extremely vague, and it doesn't really answer much about the autistic person. If you put out a survey and ask, are you religious? I think the only useful answer to that is a no rather than a yes.
Mm.
Because if they say, no, I'm not religious, it basically means they fall into a much more narrow category. But if they say, yes, I am religious, it could mean so many different things that the answer in itself isn't a particularly useful data point.
Yeah.
But there are surveys about asking these, and going through survey data I think is useful. So I've done a bunch of meta-analyses of every religion poll I could find out there that is relevant to autism. And yeah, I tried to collect them. Now, note about surveys. Surveys are really good at answering the what question. What is the state of things? They are not good for answering why. They will basically give you a point-in-time snapshot, and their responses are largely based on how the question is worded. So having built several surveys myself. I can tell you your precise wording of the question, especially when you're dealing with autistic people. Precise wording really matters. I found when dealing with autistic people, I call it the 1% rule. I don't know what the actual term for it is. But if you ask an autistic person a yes or no question and they aren't 100% sure, if there's 1% of uncertainty, they're far more likely to check no than they are yes.
Yeah.
Because they would rather not commit to it and just say this doesn't apply because it doesn't apply 100%. So anyway, that's all I'm saying is surveys are good, but surveys have some drawbacks, especially when dealing with autistic people. So last episode, we had Chris Bonello, he's an autism advocate, author, and blogger at Autistic Not Weird, who he has quite a following. He's also a Christian, and I interviewed him for this podcast. And amongst other things that he does, he runs the autism survey, which gets thousands of responses. And one of the questions is about religiosity. And I'll just let him talk about his survey here. So,
once every 3 years or so, I run an autumn survey on Autistic Not Weird. I'm running the 2022 survey right now. And the last one that came out a few years ago, I asked, among the agree or disagree statements, I have religious faith. Do you strongly agree, and so on down to strongly disagree? And what I found was a very slight lean towards being less religious among autistic people than non-autistic people, but it was far from the most influential factor. The most influential factor was geography. In fact, sorting by gender, I think it was, I'd have to read the article again, but females more likely than males and non-binary people to say agree or strongly agree. But geography was the biggest factor. Anyway, that's one angle of this. It's the geography that's and gender and yes, upbringing as well. That's more influential than whether or not a person is autistic. Autistic tend to be a bit of a factor, but yes, that's the individual really. And another thing that I thought of is, let's say, for argument's sake, that autistic people are less likely to be religious. I would put that down to my other two additional thoughts on this. First off, the very high instance of prevalence of LGBT plus people in the autism community. And let's just say that Christianity, perhaps religion in general, Christianity has not done a very good job of sharing Jesus' unconditional love and acceptance to those who, in fact, people trying to justify, oh no, it's okay to disagree with gay people's lifestyle choice because it must be a choice. Like, people have started to accept that no, sexual orientation is not a choice, but it's like people make themselves believe that it is a choice because they can't reconcile that with their belief that God does not make mistakes. And then there's people like me who believe that no, God does not make mistakes, and that's why gay people exist. And asexual people like myself, I don't massively consider myself to be a part of the LGBT plus community because I don't really do much with my asexual identity, but I am technically part of that community. The other part of it is one of the things that you've been discussing with a lot of people, I imagine, accessibility within the church for autistic people. The amount of autistic people who would be churchgoers if the church were able to accommodate autistic people. I think if there is a lean against religion by and large within the autistic community, it's probably an LGBT plus issue which the Christian community is not doing a good job of meeting, and B, an accessibility issue which churches in general may not be doing a good job of meeting.
That was Chris talking about his survey. He posts the results publicly if you want to take a look at that. For the purposes of this podcast, we'll just look at the 2022 survey, for example. So Chris put out the survey. He got 11,212 responses. 7,437 of them were autistic. So a slight majority were autistic. In Chris's survey, of those who identified as autistic, 3,898 of them responded to strongly disagree with the statement, I have religious faith, and 1,036 responded with disagree. So that is just so you don't have to do the math yourself. 52.4% said strongly disagree. 13.83% said they disagree. So total of 65.87%. And of the non-autistic respondents, there were 3,775. 895 chose strongly disagree, 370 chose disagree, so that's 36.15 and 14.95 respectively. So yeah, as Chris mentioned, biggest controlling factor that he found in his survey is geography. And I think that makes sense, to be honest. And from my data collection, that does seem to be a pretty major trend. So in cultures that are more religious, they will likely produce just more religious people in general, and that includes autistics. The number of and proportion of autistic religiosity will largely follow broad cultural trends. There'll be more self-identifying religious people in the American Bible Belt than autistic people in Stockholm or something like that. So in secular contexts, you should just generally expect fewer religious people, and that includes autistics. So another thing Chris mentioned is that autistic women were more likely to be religious than autistic men, and this trend exists in non-autistic people as well. So more women are religious than men. Now, I should clarify this just in case you aren't aware of the numbers. This is a trend that's only true in weird countries. So weird meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So in those countries, women outnumber men for participating in religion. If you look at other countries that don't fit those criteria, you get a different story. Additionally, there have been recent polls that have been done, and it turns out the factor of women being more religious than men really only holds true for Christianity. Now, whether or not it's because Christianity is very predominant in the industrialized West, maybe one thing, but if you look at other places in Africa, Southeast Asia, even in those places aren't Western, women are far more likely to be Christian than men. Not far more likely, it's about 13% more likely. But if you look at Islam, for example, the trend doesn't hold. So just a caveat there when we're talking about this data. Now, this data makes sense because you're polling English-speaking countries, and English-speaking countries are more likely to be Christian than non-English-speaking countries. So that is a factor there. If there are lots of other studies out there. If you just look at informal polling, so if you look at autism forums, so there's a big autism forum called Wrong Planet. From 2010, there's a survey. You can find like hundreds of these surveys, and I have found hundreds of these surveys, and I've tried to compile them as best I can where it makes sense to collect and overlap them. 64% of people who responded to this 2010 study said they were atheist or agnostic, 42% atheist, 24% agnostic, and others report some shades of religiosity. Only 9% of people will describe themselves as very religious. Others will describe themselves as religious, but not frequently attending religious services, and that made up the majority of religious autistic people. There are lots of other Wrong Planet surveys. In one of them, the atheist and agnostic category was the most prominent. Funnily enough, the second most common religious belief was, I like to create my own religious beliefs. And we'll talk about that tendency in later episodes. Most other surveys that I've looked at will show this pattern of autistic people disproportionately identifying as atheist. One of the things is autistic people, if you compare them to the non-autistic population, they are far more to check strongly disagree with the statement, I have religious faith, than the general population who might say disagree or neutral. I call it the light switch effect for autistic people, that like autistic people are either fully in or fully out. They're either on one side or the other. And for religion, I find a lot of them, if they're not religious, they're very much not religious. And you don't have as many like lukewarm religious people. If they've thought about it, they're like, yeah, nope, don't like this. So yeah, it comes up a lot on places like Reddit. So I focused my research on 9 different autism-focused subreddits, 3 Christian subreddits, where people ask questions about autism, Wrong Planet, and Ask to Be Central for my data gathering. One really good example of one of these forum posts is there's a poll on the autism subreddit, and it just asks, is anyone here religious / believes in God, by a user named GeoWeavy. And it's a great instructive example of how autistic people tend to talk about religion. If you ever want to, if you do this research and you go on these forums, it's really funny because half the comments are always like, you are the biggest idiot in the world if you are religious, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Yeah, they're vicious. And usually autistic religious believers don't talk about religion on autism forums because of the amount of massive blowback they'll get. And what I've found is that where autistic Christians do congregate to talk about Christianity is not on autism forums, but on Christian forums under the under an autism subcategory. And so generally autism forums are not healthy and welcoming places for religious belief.
No.
I'll just say that. Yeah, basically analysis from all these like different types of surveys by just looking at comments and subcomments and unique users and stuff showed that around 8 to 12% of respondents out of 7,300 unique responses, 8 to 12% showed people openly identifying as religious. So when I filtered my data mining stuff for geolocation where I could determine it, I found some pretty interesting trends. One of the trends that I found that often isn't well indicated in a lot of these surveys is that autistic people in more secular spaces are disproportionately more likely to be non-religious. So what I'm saying there is, in general, if you control for gender and like socioeconomic class and things like that, if you can, and if you look for a culture that is more religious, I'll just choose Louisiana, for example, just because I know that one off the top of my head, and you pick a region, you'll find that autistic people will be around 10 to 25% less likely to be Christian. That's to say, if you were to take 1,000 non-autistic people from a very religious place, like Louisiana, around 800 to 850 will self-identify as Christian, where if you were to take an equivalent 1,000-person autistic subsample, around 600 to 700 of those would identify as Christian. So you will still get more not identifying as Christian, but if you go somewhere like London, England, or Toronto, Canada, or New York City, or Stockholm, Sweden, autistic people will be more likely to identify as non-Christian, in some cases up to 50% less likely. So if you were to take 1,000 non-autistic people from a less religious place, let's say 300 to 400 of those 1,000 will self-identify as Christian. And if you take an equivalent 1,000-person autistic group, around 150 to 200 of those will identify as Christian. So basically, what I found is that if Christianity isn't in the water, if it's not permeating the culture, and if there isn't a lot of these social pressures and cultural incentives or disincentives to participate in religious practice, autistic people are significantly less likely to be Christian. And if there's a cultural expectation that you'll be Christian, if everyone around you is, you're still less likely than a non-autistic person, but you are significantly less likely if you are in a secular place where there isn't that same social expectation of religiosity.
I do wonder how much of that also as well, autistic people, how many of them would be autistic people who originally came from these places like Louisiana and moved to these more secular places like London and Toronto and New York City, precisely because it would have been an easier time to be secular in a more secular context, if that makes sense. I wonder like how much of that would have occurred. Like people, when they tend to feel like that there's some sort of misfitting within the community they originate from, they are more likely to move to a different community. So I wonder how much that also can impact on some of those numbers, because that is a very high proportion within the secular contexts.
Yeah, no, I think that is definitely a factor. Like exactly what you mentioned. Like a lot of autistic people also have just in general Christianity for them is a pretty rocky ride. They
Mm-hmm.
don't have the best experiences inside Christianity. They don't have good experiences in youth group. Like their
Mm.
world is dissonant and their experience with it is dissonant. And so when they go if they go from a religious culture to a non-religious culture, or a lot of times you'll see when they go off to university and they leave their cultural context and go into a more secular cultural context,
Yeah.
they will encounter places that don't make them feel dissonant. And then they'll be like, whoa, this is so much better. Why am I spending all this time not
Yeah.
being? So yeah, just a final note about all these religiosity surveys. Generally speaking, they show a negative correlation, and I have found one or two that show a positive correlation, but those are Reddit posts and stuff like that, and I don't think those are particularly reliable. I think the only use for those types of posts are to look at them all together as one big clump. So individual posts you might be able to find ones where autistic people are more likely to be Christian but or religious, but vast majority are not. I will say because these surveys are done in English in generally places where people in the West congregate, religiosity is often interchangeable with like Abrahamic monotheism or more specifically like Christianity and Judaism. Data, again, mostly taken from the English speaking West. I don't have great data on Islamic, Buddhist, or Hindu countries. I think that would be really interesting to get that data and to look at the comparisons between rates of autistic religiosity between different forms of cultural expression and to look at, I could see examples of Buddhism in which maybe there are some expressions in some cultures in which autistic people might be more likely than their non-autistic counterparts. But I really don't know. And I really don't have the data, so I can't really speculate on that. I will say when we'll probably get into this in a later section, but when you break down autistic religiosity by Christian denomination, you do see a lot more trends of some denominations being a lot more autistic friendly. And that's mostly the liturgical high church, I'll call it, that tends to be more autism friendly. And so if the autistic person is in a community or a social context in which they belong to the liturgical high church, they're more likely to identify as religious than a person who was raised in a context where the dominant religion is like a non-denominational evangelical. Anyway, that's the data we get from surveys, and overall the trend is pretty much in line with the stereotype. You'll find autistic people are less likely to be religious, but as we said, there are some problems with surveys. So we can look at some research papers and some published peer review literature. And as we all know, published peer review literature about autism is always super accurate and done very well with no critique. Just kidding. I, I sometimes worry that in my podcast about autism, a lot of autistic people will miss my very dry sense of humor. That's a joke. Yeah, we'll talk more specifically about this. So let's look at some published stuff. So one of the first papers I ever encountered was this paper called Mentalizing Deficits Constrain a Belief in a Personal God. And I got to it because someone wrote an article in The Atlantic about Niels Bohr. And one of the references was this article that showed that autistic people were less likely to be Christian. So this paper basically has as its hypothesis that autistic people have, on average, deficient mentalizing abilities, or autistic people aren't very good at using theory of mind. So, theory of mind, for those of you who don't know, is your ability to understand the inner workings of another person's mind or understand their emotional states as separate from yours. And so, the hypothesis of this paper is basically that religious belief and components of religious belief heavily utilize this mentalizing ability, this idea to imagine and intuitively understand another mind outside of your own and its feelings and attributes towards you. And so their idea is because autistic people are deficient in this ability, they're less likely to be religious because they're less likely to see God as having emotions, feelings, and all those things directed towards you. Whereas a non-autistic person would have this, and so religious experience would be more meaningful to them and they would stay. So that's kind of like the broad overview of what they're trying to get at. And autistic people, their thinking is, will not use their mentalizing to conceptualize God, so they're going to be less likely to believe in a personal God specifically. The paper also proposes that this will explain the gender gap in belief in a personal God, because men generally have weaker mentalizing capabilities than women, according to this paper. The paper contains 4 studies. Study 1 compared autistic people to a non-autistic control, and they controlled the variable of IQ. Controlling for IQ, they found that autistic participants were only 11% as likely as their non-autistic controls to endorse God, or to strongly endorse a belief in a personal God. Controls for various other cognitive capabilities didn't show the difference. Controls for mentalizing deficits did show this difference. So what they did is they looked at a bunch of people with a bunch of different cognitive abilities, and they found that if you match their IQs and other cognitive abilities, that the people with mentalizing deficits were significantly less likely to be religious. However, they used a really small sample set for this. I'll just say that outright. Study 2 took a comparison of Canadian students, they're autistic and non-autistic, and they looked at factors such as EQ, gender, IQ, mentalizing, and systematizing abilities. And again, they showed that when you control for autistic mentalizing deficits, those mentalizing deficits, or the groups that were controlled for mentalizing deficits, were negatively correlated with a belief in a personal God. They looked and they replicated study 2, but with an American group, and they also included 2 of the big 5 personality factors called conscientiousness and agreeableness, and they confirmed autism as the primary controlling factor for less religiousness when they were controlling for age, gender, educational attainment, income, frequency of religious attendance, that type of thing. And then finally, study 4, in addition to looking at EQ, which is like empathy quotient, they added a second distinct measure of mentalizing using the performance-based read the mind in the eyes of the mind reading tasks. For those who don't know, it's also called like the eye slit experiment, where they show you like a person's, basically the bridge of their nose to the top of their eyebrows, and they ask you what mood the person's in. I've done a lot of these in my time volunteering for various university things. The validity of this experiment has been questioned by autism advocates, and they've done, there are critiques of whether or not that's an actual valid thing. But anyway, they looked for standard deviations, an increase in autism scores, and participants were only 66% as likely to strongly endorse God. A gender gap was also observed, with men 47% as likely as women to strongly endorse God. And then they looked at mentalizing capability, low levels of education, and frequent religious attendance, all predicted religiosity. Meaning that if they had high mentalizing capability, low education, and frequently attended religious services, they were more likely to be religious. That is the study. I think this study sucks. For a lot of reasons. So I've gone through this, and maybe if people want, I can go through and dissect it later. I don't think they targeted mentalizing in the way that they think they did. I don't think that they actually controlled for mentalizing in the way they think they did. Because one of the things is that they mostly interviewed adults on the autism spectrum, and mentalizing deficits in adults are not as easily seen. The biggest gaps that you'll see if you look at like studies between autistic people and non-autistic people is mostly in children. So it's mostly like developmental in children, but by the time they get to adulthood, most adults on the autism spectrum don't struggle with lower order mentalizing tasks. They will struggle with things like spontaneous and intuitive ascription of mental states. So if you show them a picture of a person's face for a split second, and then you have 2 seconds to decide whether this person is happy to see you or not happy to see you. Autistic people tend to do much worse, or autistic adults tend to do much worse. But if you give them a few more seconds, they'll be on par with most of the other people. There's also something called the double empathy problem. Are you familiar, Amy, with the double empathy problem?
I'm familiar. I'm not as great at articulating it as I am with some other aspects of the spectrum. But
I'll fire away then.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, so basically the double empathy problem is a critique of the mentalizing theory of mind deficit model of autism. So this is a model of autism that was popularized by a researcher named Simon Baron-Cohen. Famously the cousin of Borat. Not famous for anything else. No, I'm just kidding. He is actually the cousin of Borat, though. But basically, he's somewhat controversial within the autism community, mostly because he had an idea that autism was like the extreme of the male brain. And that has likely led to a wild amount of underdiagnosis of autistic women. But basically, one of his ideas was that one of the reasons autistic people are the way that they are is that they don't have the ability to intuitively understand what's going on in other people's heads. Like they have this mentalizing deficiency. What autistic advocates pointed out is, wait a second, non-autistic people can't read what's going on in my head either. I don't know if you've had this happen to you, but very frequently non-autistic people will think I'm communicating something to them non-verbally when I'm just like, I'm doing nothing, and they're just reading wildly into me, and they are not picking up what I'm laying down. And the thing that autism advocates pointed out,
be quite direct about something, and then they might infer that you mean something else, and you try to make it clear to them, no, this is literally what I am conveying to you. But because of the way a lot of neurotypicals are socialized, they think that there's some reading between the lines that needs to occur, when autistic people generally do not communicate in this kind of manner. Like that's an example I can think of.
So I'll give an example from my personal life. So one of my wife's friends, and like me, my wife's friend, and a bunch of other people from our church went to this social event, and one of the young women at the social event didn't realize I was married and was apparently being quite forward. I didn't understand it, but my wife's friend was getting very defensive about it, and she was apparently communicating to me non-verbally that, like, what's going on? Is everything okay? And I was blissfully unaware of the entire thing unfolding. I just had no idea whatsoever. But my wife's friend was like, oh yeah, and John was like telling me that I could see from his eyes he knew what was going on. It is just like, nope, no, you did not. I had no idea. Like, I was completely oblivious to this entire situation the whole time. And that's an example of the double empathy problem. So my inability to read the social situation going on is considered an autism deficit. However, her inability to read what was going on inside of me is for some reason not considered a deficit. Right? Yeah. Because fundamentally, we both failed the same task, right? When you think about it, neither of us did the thing we were supposed to do. We both misinterpreted what the other person was thinking and feeling. However, in autism research, it's only considered a deficit when it happens with the autistic person, and it's not considered a deficit when it happens with a non-autistic person. And they found, actually quite consistently, that autistic people are really good at reading other autistic people. They're just not good at reading non-autistic people. And a lot of autistic people will develop like an autism radar where they can like immediately clock other autistic people with very little effort. And that's happening because you are intuitively ascribing mental states to them. Like you're mentalizing, right? You are understanding what's going on in that person's head. Yeah. And so do autistic people really lack the ability to mentalize? Or do we have just a hard time reading people who aren't autistic. And it doesn't seem like it would be a mentalizing deficit if we also couldn't do it with autistic people. But a non-autistic person doesn't have a mentalizing deficit because they don't do it with an autistic person. Anyway, that's called the double empathy problem, where like both groups fail to do the mentalizing task, but only one group is considered to have a mentalizing deficit. And like another problem with the paper is really what the paper did is it didn't check for belief in a personal God. What it did is it looked for specific spiritual practices and ideas that are specific and contingent to Christianity and like to a specific expression of Christianity in our current day, in a current mode of expression. So did they test if autistic people were less likely to believe in a personal God as defined in this specific sense that an autistic person would define it, or as defined by the vast majority of non-autistic people? And anyway, I can go on for days about this, and I'll stop. But basically, I don't think that mentalizing deficits are actually the thing that they measured here. I think they just measured if autistic people are less likely to participate in non-autistic expressions of religion. And I think the answer is yes. That's the only thing they measured.
Yeah, like it's very funny to think that ascribing belief to a personal God, and they had such an impersonal definition of what that was. So, like that was something I detected, which struck me as a bit of an egregious oversight.
Yep, it's not great. Anyway, there are more studies. So there's another one, and it is from, I think, 2008. It's called Religious Beliefs of Persons with High-Functioning Autism, and it was done in the Department of Psychology of Boston University. If you just Google those things, you'll be able to find it. From the abstract, it says, this paper investigates proposals that individual differences in beliefs will reflect cognitive processing styles, with high-functioning autism being an extreme style that will predispose people towards non-belief, i.e. atheism or agnosticism. They found that persons with autism spectrum disorder were more likely than those in their neurotypical comparison group to identify as atheist or agnostic, and, if religious, were more likely to construct their own religious belief systems. Remember that survey I talked about from Wrong Planet. Non-belief was also higher than those who were attracted to systematizing activities as measured by the systematizing quotient. So that's just me reading from the abstract. Basically, like me and many other people, they noticed that autism forums expressed disproportionately religious or non-religious dispositions. So they went on autism forums and just found what happens on autism forums. The paper itself had 3 studies. One study analyzed beliefs of 192 people, 61 of them were autistic. And they basically hypothesized that cognitive processes like those found in autism were more likely to produce less religious people. And then they hypothesized some cognitive traits that could predict religious belief, while others could predict a lack of religious belief. So they created a little chart that you can see. One column has characteristics of high-functioning autistics, and they label one characteristic as hypoactive agency detection, concrete literal-mindedness, discomfort with symbolic fluidity, local processing bias, attraction to scientism, the need for sameness and predictability, and the difficulty navigating new social ritual or relationships. And they basically said that if we look at these 4 factors alone and we just look at autism through these 4 factors, we think that these alone should be cause to detect whether or not, or predict that autistic people are less likely to be religious. Study 2 looked at forum posts, and they compared forum posts from 2 different websites. One was Wrong Planet, which was specifically autism, and one was Go Live Wire, which apparently was a forum back in 2008. So they looked at 195 autistic users and 195 non-autistic users on the religion and philosophy subforums, and they collected their posts from a year's worth of posting. This was the paper that actually gave me the idea to start my data science research, where I just did mass bulk collecting. This was the one where I'm like, I should do this, but on a scale much larger than this. But yeah, and basically posts were analyzed for religiosity, and they found, again, a negative correlation between cognitive traits and religiosity, meaning that people with autistic cognitive traits were less likely to be religious. And then study 3, the last study, was an internet survey. They covered 61 autistics and 192 non-autistics under 30. They measured AQ, SQ, or AQ for like autism quotient, SQ for systematizing quotient, mentalizing or mind reading from doing the iSlit experiment. And they found that autistic cognitive processing led to a correlation of lack of religiosity. They also found that autistics were more likely than non-autistics to make up their own religious beliefs, which, again, foreshadowing, this will appear again. So those were the research papers that kind of are out there and cover this type of thing. There are many critiques like this. From my own research, I found that another variable that you need to consider is 60 to 78% of autistic people who say they believe in God have at least a vague notion of Christianity, which means the other remaining 40 to 22% who say they believe in God do not have a description of God that most people would be able to recognize and properly put into a survey. If you look at interviews and biographies, you will find some interesting results. We talked about John Elder Robeson and tangentially Temple Grandin. And Temple Grandin actually writes about her belief in God, and she describes God as a force. And she has a very specific way of describing God, which is not how you would typically see God described in normal terms. And when you talk to autistic people like to intellectualize and systematize and think about things and reflect about things. And so they'll often have very complex definitions and very detailed definitions of, if they believe in God, what they will believe in. And they tend to avoid anthropomorphic terms, which are very common in normal non-autistic descriptions of God. They will very rarely talk about God as if God is a person. That's not to say they don't talk about God as a person, because in Christianity, God is, or God became a person. It's just when they speak about God, they tend to avoid anthropomorphic terms and things like that. One thing I've noticed is that Christian autistics, especially ones who are like practicing and committed to Christianity, will not explicitly contradict the standard Christian doctrine that you find. However, they will often come very close to the line of orthodoxy. If you think of orthodoxy as being a spectrum, they are on the edges of the spectrum of orthodoxy in most times.
Yeah.
And although their beliefs may not explicitly contradict the explicit doctrine, they will often hold to minority positions within their religious belief. So an example of this is autistic people are significantly more likely, I have found autistic Christians are much more likely to endorse a form of universalism that I always mispronounce it, but the final restoration of all things is the English translation.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they're more likely
familiar
to
with
endorse
that.
that.
Yeah.
It's like apocataxis. So autistic people are more likely to endorse that. You will not find most Christians actively endorsing this. And you will often find that autistic Christians will be very into some pretty esoteric Christian theology. And they will often hold views that you will not find being preached from the pulpit on Sunday. If you want to hear about medieval mysticism, you will hear it from autistics. And surveys and things like that try to cover autistic religious belief aren't really asking if you've read like Hildegard or something like that.
I've yet to come across a survey that's asked questions about St. Hildegard or St. Teresa of Avila at all. And yeah, you are correct. It's especially with the medieval mysticism thing, a lot of autistic women particularly, because so much of medieval mysticism came very much from a female perspective. A lot of autistic women within the church, you find they're very into that sort of, yeah, as you say, somewhat orthodox, but still somewhat esoteric side of it.
Yeah, and so when you're asking questions about belief in God, and someone says, yes, I believe in God, however, I don't agree with this definition because I like this particular articulation found in the Desert Fathers. It's like,
Yes.
the autistic person will say, no, I don't agree with this statement, and you'll mischaracterize. Anyway, so I'm just saying, surveying autistic people and doing data mining about autistic people is very hard to get proper, precise definitions because autistic people are just hard to deal with on questions of religions in surveys. I know this is someone who's been doing it for a long time, and it's one of the primary reasons I started doing interviews. I kept getting frustrated because I would leave like room for comments on things, and then I would get these long, detailed explanations of this. I normally would have checked strongly agree. However, because you worded this like this, I think that, or someone like a thing like I hold to a like lowercase o form of orthodoxy, and they'll be like, I'm not sure I agree with the findings of the Council of Chalcedon. I think Miaphysite Christians are within the valid scope of Christians. No, I don't agree with this.
Oh my goodness.
And it's okay, man.
I think
it's not what I'm trying to ask.
I think it's one of the biggest ironies within the autistic community that our need to be so precise can often lead to a lack of precision, especially when trying to collate findings.
Yes.
I think it's one of the biggest ironies of the autistic community that keeps cropping up in studies and surveys.
Yep. Anyway, I'm just saying, with all these surveys and stuff like that, we need to keep all these things in mind. And just a question. For example, if you were to survey practicing autistic Christians, and instead of asking if they were Christians, you asked, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? You would get a significant number of those practicing autistic Christians saying no. Not because they're not practicing Christians, but because they find the wording of personal relationship with Jesus to be confusing, and they're not quite sure what it means. And we'll get into this later. But anyway, the surveys do show negative correlations, but I don't think the best surveys actually come from data mining. I think they actually come from interviews with autistic people themselves. But in general, what they do is they show trends. And the trends are, as we've been talking, autistic people will be less likely to be religious with respect to a Christian understanding of God in the English-speaking West. And that's what I have to say about that. So yeah, surveys indicate, just the final wrap-up, autistic people are less likely to self-identify as religious. Autistic people are less likely to profess a belief in God. And of those who express a belief in God, a majority will express a Christian conception of God. And within those that express a Christian conception of God, somewhere between around 20 to 30% will not produce a standard or normal conception of it. I think I've already beat to death all the issues with surveys and stuff, so I don't think we should, I don't think I need to answer more questions. Have I been clear? Does this make sense generally, or is there any questions that you think I've left unanswered here that I might be able to answer?
No, you've covered a lot of ground here, and I think just to back up your point that a lot of the information that you get from surveys do have to do with trends, and I think if anyone wants to be educated on the subject of autism and religious practice and Christianity in particular, I think it's probably time to go beyond the surveys and start examining these more in-depth questions. And I understand that, say, a neurology or psychology department, that might be a limitation on them because they have to deal so specifically with data. I think that this presents a unique opportunity if this academic pursuit of research with these correlations is to expand. I think it's this starts becoming a question more for theology departments, because analyzing these more in-depth questions and explorations on the nature of autistic belief is probably going to bear more fruit from studies done from that perspective. And at the very least, with these interviews to back up a lot of what you've described here, is always like a good start.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like, I think if you actually want to get serious about the particularities of autistic belief and autistic expression, I think what you really need to do is you need to look at Christians, ex-Christians, and Christian curious, and just look at what they have to say and just do the very hard, laborious work of just categorizing and cataloging all this stuff, which is like what I've been doing for all these years. So, but I don't blame academic institutions for not doing it. So, like, I have probably spent over 3,000 hours just doing interviews with autistic people. And I include, so ones that I've specifically done for this research project, probably around 1,500 hours. But I do a lot of interviews and a lot of discussions, not for this research project. And this has probably been like well over 3,000 hours of work, which is a non-trivial amount of work for most people. And yeah, I don't know if I can expect that from people, but if you do want to know about religiosity, you actually need to talk to the autistic people, and you need to talk to them for a long time, and then you need to compile the results. And this is laborious work, but I've actually done the laborious work. I think like a really good way to figure out, so we talked about the what, right? Like we talked about what the state is, but not really the why. And I think one of the best ways to figure out why is to simply just ask autistic people why. So whenever I did interviews, I asked Christians and ex-Christians and Christian curious people, do you think autistic people are less likely to be Christian than their neurotypical peers? If so, why or why not?
I think so, yeah. I think there's a lot of social aspects to Christianity. Meeting up in small groups, having a lot of community involvement, folks that open up their homes and have dinner parties, or they break bread, share stuff with each other. I think there's a lot of social aspects to Christianity that would be difficult for folks in the autistic spectrum to cope with, especially if it isn't like a community that is catered to suit those needs.
Yeah, most of the autistic people I meet are atheists. A lot of them are very staunchly atheists and almost seem to struggle with understanding why somebody could be not necessarily just Christian, but religious in general. Some of it is because there is almost inherently a need to believe in something that you can't fully comprehend. It is far easier for me to tell you what God is not than what God is. I cannot give a definition to God. And from somebody who's very logically minded, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I cannot test God's existence. I can point to God's existence through examples, but that's not necessarily satisfactory for a lot of people.
If there is a lean against religion by and large within the autistic community, it's probably an LGBT plus issue, which the Christian community is not doing a good job of meeting, and B, an accessibility issue, which churches in general may not be doing a good job of meeting.
I don't know that I've given it really much consideration, other than that in our broad culture, the group of people who are giving explanatory pitches for the universe and our place in it that is very like data centric and like rigidly mechanistic, that's rational materialism. And I think this is maybe part of it. I'm hesitant to say Christianity ought to play that game, because I find a lot of apologetic theology deeply unconvincing. And I don't know that is going to be convincing on the level that rational materialism has. I do think you need to start from the sort of McIntyre, no, you can't look at this piecemeal. You can't look at this like each data point and see if you believe it. It has to be holistic. And I think that people who have certain expressions of autism that are similar to mine sometimes struggle with that sort of holistic reasoning. I think we can do it, but we need to have the whole picture fairly well explained before we can start doing it. And to be clear, I think that's a weakness in us, not a weakness in Christianity. However, on the other hand, it's also perhaps a weakness in how it's exposited, because I think you can do it. I just don't think it's been done.
I think the way that Christianity is practiced in the West makes it extremely difficult for someone who's autistic to want to be a part of that. Because a lot of how we practice Christianity is in the West is filtered through several different cultural lenses that prioritize certain types of minds and prioritize certain types of behaviors. And oftentimes autistic people or neurodivergent don't necessarily fit those cookie cutter molds. And I can see why it is less likely. But if you look at, and I can say this because I've studied this, if you look at like the origin, like all religions are Eastern, right? Like we didn't come up with anything here in the West, right? So if you look at ancient Near Eastern practices of these ancient religions, it's filtered through a different cultural lens, right? In the East, people are a little bit more stoic and they internalize things more. So that's why you see a lot of meditation and those types of things, right? That kind of more fits my neurology, right? Where I'm not necessarily asked to perform for a bunch of people and have my Christianity measured by how well I socialize, right? But that tends to be how it's done in the West, right? You're a good Christian if you socialize in the way that is neurotypical. And so that tends to be a huge barrier. Whereas if you go to other cultures, that's much less of an expectation. So I think, yeah, it in this country, and I'll just say Western civilization, it's probably harder to be a Christian if you're autistic.
Yeah, so I looked at, not many studies have been done on this, but a handful have. And the general gist from all of these studies, which compared the faith of neurotypicals to autistic people, was that for whatever reason, autistic people are way more likely to be atheist or agnostic. They also found that even those who are religious, as we've been saying, are less likely to have a really personal conception of God and have more of a slightly less intimate view of God, if that makes sense. It's more intellectual. Yeah, so I think a lot of it can be pinned down to, as we've been saying, Western Christianity's perhaps overemphasis on making it very Jesus is my boyfriend type. But there's other reasons that have been suggested. So there's one paper, which is quite interesting, that said autistic people generally don't think as teleologically as neurotypicals, meaning we don't tend to see grand overarching purposes behind random events. So this researcher, they asked, so for example, neurotypicals to look back on significant events in their life, and they were more likely to say, oh yes, God planned that, or God was behind that. Whereas the autistic people were more likely to say, it just happened, that's how things are. It's more just, they are what they are, and that's that. It's almost more of an existentialist view.
Churches are generally not great at, and this is not a thing that is unique to churches. This is like a general characteristic of the neurotypical world. Churches are not great at sussing out and detecting like the real deep sort of spiritual needs of people on the spectrum. Autistic people, and for our part, are maybe also not great at communicating like what is really like our problem in a way that like a neurotypical church is probably able to understand.
I definitely think there is a strong drive in a lot of autistic people, myself included, about questioning things, and it's hard when to have faith in something and to blindly trust something without one person who will go through and be like, oh, I need to know like the pros and cons of everything, or I need to really analyze this and have all the answers and get all the research before I can like actually give my opinion on something or accept something as a given. And I think that is very common, that actually, a lot of autistic people have a different perspective, or they don't just want to accept something because it is the done thing or because someone said so. And unfortunately, I think that, and I think this is possibly more of a trouble with the institution of church more than Christianity itself, that there is an element of people don't take kindly to being questioned or asked, like, why is this? Why is that? How does this work? And I think that then leads to autistic people feeling like they don't fit in, like they don't have a safe place. It's a very common thing anyway, so why would you put yourself into that position again?
Where my mind goes, I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about it because I'm a straight white woman, but where my mind goes when you ask that question is just with my experience with the autistic community. There is a very diverse population within the community, and like I said earlier, a lot of people who fall on the gender spectrum and don't identify as male or female, they are transgender, or their sexuality is different than something that's allowed in the church. And for that reason alone, I feel like a lot of Christianity, especially in America, is, not everyone, but a lot of it is you can come in, but then we're going to try to tell you something that you have to change. And for that reason, because I feel like a lot of the autistic community tends to be more minorities, I feel like it just hasn't been communicated as a really safe place for them. So that's where my mind goes whenever you ask that question.
I'll say this very cautiously because I don't want to patronize anyone, but I think there's a lot of parallels between formerly Christian autistics and the ex-evangelical movement, right? That there's been a lot of damage done by bad theology. And I think one of the things that autistics are really worse at than neurotypicals is ignoring cognitive dissonance, right? I think that a lot of neurotypicals can say, oh, I don't really believe that. Let's just forget about it and ignore it. And that's, in some ways, that's a very good thing, right? That's probably a healthy way to be in a lot of different respects. I don't think autistics are as readily able to do that. And I think that's a good thing in a lot of different ways too, right? But I think that once you notice, if you've been taught this is the way to treat scripture and to treat theology and to understand who God is and what the Bible is and what all this means, and you start to see holes in that account, then I don't know. There are some people who search out for an alternative account. But if you don't have that at the ready, then the only thing that you have to do with it is just throw it the heck away, right? And so I think a lot of autistics are in that boat, in that they've been shown a certain understanding of Christianity and a certain way of looking at the Bible and looking at God. And they've realized that it doesn't hold water for any number of reasons, right? And I don't think autistics are capable of saying that part obviously has a problem, but I'll just stick with the rest of it. If one pillar of the foundation is flawed, then get rid of the whole damn thing.
I don't know if autistic people are more or less likely to be Christian than neurotypical people. What I would say is that it's my experience as myself and observing fellow autistic people with whom I'm in a relationship in church life, that certain forms of Christianity are innately more and less welcoming to us. And so if you're looking at the forms that are innately unwelcoming to us, we're less likely to be there. And if those forms have successfully convinced somebody that it's our way or don't be religious, if they set up that dichotomy and people believe in that dichotomy, they're going to choose to be not religious. And I certainly was presented with that dichotomy as a younger person, that either we're right or be non-religious.
I haven't done the research, and to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know that I would probably say every other autistic person that I've met isn't a Christian. I'll put it that way. Yeah, the autistic people who I met were mostly also on the debate team with me, and all of them were atheists, and one of the reasons why I continued to get into apologetics. And they were caught up in the wave of Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and those guys, the new atheists. And I would say that they're less likely to be Christian. And I can speak to my own experience in this. Worship and church services and an autistic person like myself in the life of the church, that can be deeply alienating sometimes. Because you have all of these other people, and I've been there in youth group before, who seem to have something that they can bring to the table and that the church wants, and the church wants to use, and the church wants to put into action and service. So, if you're, especially as a teenager, a lot of my friends were on the worship team. And I would watch them on the worship team, and I would see other Christians on more service-oriented thing, and I'd see other Christians who had a gift with tech, work in tech. And for me, my special interest as an autistic person was theology. That's what I threw my all into. That's how I expressed myself. I don't think I spoke a word. I hardly ever spoke a word in high school if I wasn't talking about Jesus in some capacity, right? And that was a difficult thing for me at the time, because I had all of my peers being used by the church in these various ways, using things that they were genuinely gifted with. I felt like I was at best not needed, and at worst not wanted in a lot of the church contexts that I served, because who's this kid who's walking in here all theologically inclined, and is he trying to challenge the pastor? Is he trying to usurp his authority by asking him all of these different questions? And that I got that a lot at every church that I've been, where it's like me wanting to talk about this thing that makes me excited is taken as you need to stay in your place. That's not the kind of question you ask a pastor unless you're trying to bring him like a challenge.
I guess the first question that people might be wondering when we're trying to ask the why question, how did I go about trying to determine this? Like, what was the actual methodology that I used to try to answer the why to the question, why are autistic people less likely to be Christian? And basically my thinking on this was to isolate various demographics of ex-Christians and non-Christians who had seriously considered Christianity and ask them what they think. The other tack was to take autistic Christians, especially those who were struggling with the faith, and ask them. Mostly because when you're looking at why you're less likely to be Christian, the people that will probably have the most insight into these are people who are not having a good time and not having the smoothest sailing with Christianity. For example, if you find an autistic person who's just having a great time, has never really struggled with Christianity, and has managed to land themselves in a niche where everything's pretty good for the most part, it's not as likely that they'll have really good insights into answering the question why. But if you look at someone who's been through the ringer of Christianity or been bashing their head against the wall trying to figure it out, I think they would probably have the best insight into why. And so I asked a lot of people targeting various demographics, asking why they think this might be the case, and just going in to hear their reasoning for why they left, hear what their pain points were. And that's how I set about trying to answer this question. And for answering this question, I found the two groups that were the most useful for getting this insight were ex-Christians and Christians who have gone through a period of deconstruction or who were currently going through, I'll just say, a rough patch in their journey. Now, that's not to say that people who were never Christian aren't a good resource. I just found that non-Christian autistics were a very mixed bag when it came to trying to answer these questions. I'd talk to some of them and ask them why they think autistic people are less likely to be Christian. And sometimes I'd get responses like, well, it's self-evidently not true because we know the Bible was invented by the Romans at the Council of Nicaea. It's okay, well, that's just factually wrong. Like, that's just historically not true. So I don't think this is actually giving me good insight here. So that's not to say that no non-Christian autistics gave good insight. A lot of them did, because a lot of them had been to evangelism events and things like that and were completely turned off by them. And so those are good and useful data points. But overall, I wanted to make sure that the people that I used to answer this question, why, were people who had taken Christianity seriously or really gave it the time of day. And yeah, so for that, I classified one group called ex-Christians. So ex-Christians, just to define the demographic, they're obviously people who were once Christian and are no longer Christian. But in order to categorize them as ex-Christian, I wanted to make sure that they were over 18 when they deconverted, they demonstrated a sincere commitment to the Christian faith, and they had self-professed belief. So I wanted to make these three criteria because a person could technically be considered ex-Christian if they left the faith when they were 10, but a lot of times a 10-year-old doesn't quite understand what they're doing. They might not actually know what it is that they're rejecting. And they might not have a super good grasp on what they're dealing with. But an 18-year-old usually will. Especially an 18-year-old who's been in the church, who considers himself a sincere and professed believer. And also a demographic that I don't think is as useful would be people who were raised in a nominally Christian household, but they were essentially culturally Christian, didn't really participate, didn't really do any of that stuff, and they just kind of grew out of it as they left. Because, I mean, the reasons that they're no longer Christian is pretty obvious. They never really were interested in it to begin with. That's not to say I didn't consider these people or these people in these groups. I just labeled them under the non-Christian category. So when I'm talking about ex-Christians, I'm talking about people who were sincerely in the faith, genuinely were giving it a shot, and were like really participating in it. My sources for this were, of course, data mining, but I think the richest source where I got the best types of information was interviews. So I've done over 100 voice call interviews, and I've done 50 or more. I don't have great records of that over texts, like chat messaging on social media applications, or using the chat features of different websites and forums, text, email, just sending things back and forth. A lot of ex-Christians aren't out to their families, and so they don't want to accidentally out themselves, so a lot of them aren't willing to do voice interviews, but many of them were willing to do interviews over text or email. That's where I collected a lot of my data for this. Just on a personal note, I also went through a pretty intense deconstruction process. It was pretty quick for me. It took around 6 months to go from start to finish, which is typically a lot shorter than it takes most people to go through their deconstruction phase. But yeah, so I left the faith, and I left it for around 10 years. So I was a professing atheist, or maybe professing is not the right word. I was like a Sam Harris style new atheist for around 10 years. As many young autistic men are. If you wanna find a community of autistic men, just go to a lot of the communities that formed around new atheism, and you'll find lots. So I unfortunately was not an exception to that, and had my Reddit atheist phase as well. I also have personal experience with it, and I think Amy, you also have quite a bit of experience with it as well.
Yeah, I never really left any kind of belief in God, but in terms of connection to the Christian community, there was a time there where I would visit churches, but I wasn't really committing to any of them, and I was very averse to committing to any of them for a while. And even in my earliest years as a Catholic, I was still a bit patchy with my commitment. And that wasn't for a lack of motivation. It was just I was working out a lot of religious trauma. I did try being an atheist when I was in late high school. That lasted 2 weeks. I think it's very funny you mentioned about, yeah, if you want to find a group of autistic men, especially in the last 10 years, you just go to a New Atheist forum. And I think that was something I think, ironically, New Atheism was what made atheism very off-putting to me, because it seemed to just be a dark mirror image of the very fundamentalism that I was trying to pass out and extricate myself from. And really, it really fell into some of the same issues, like the black and white thinking, the very plain sense literalist modernist interpretation of the scriptures. It was to me just as restrictive a view of the world as fundamentalist Christianity was. Also, they were preachy as hell, and I just balked at anything that wanted to win me as a convert, partly because of the trauma, but also just I don't like being condescended to. And it's something about a lot of advertisements, sales pitches, and a lot of kind of bashing over the head type of proselytizing comes across that way. And even the ones that try to come across as relatable, the more relatable they try to present themselves, the more I balk at it, regardless of what the belief system is. So I think as well, it's something really good that you touch on was about the demographic that you define as ex-Christian and how you came to that definition. And I think that is so important, because a lot of ex-Christians and a lot of us who are still Christian but have deconstructed and reconstructed our faith we often have similar accusations leveled at us whenever we do kind of come to conflict within Christian spaces. And that's often, there's very commonly this accusation that people are ex-Christian because they wanted to indulge in their sins, which, if you've met an autistic ex-Christian, the most indulgent thing that they'll do is probably spend a bit too much on their Magic the Gathering collecting hobby. We're not talking like these style. I have yet to meet someone who was an autistic ex-Christian and got into, a whole bunch of vice and sin. I've done more vices, even when I was, still professing some belief in God, than people who had left the faith altogether. So, that is such a straw man. Another straw man that I've heard is that either A, they were never truly Christian to begin with, or B, the people that had traumatized them within Christian spaces, because very often there is a lot of religious trauma coming from these accounts, is that they weren't real Christians. So for the first part, it's basically to dismiss their experience in some way, to kind of try and run defense for God. And I mean, God is an omnipotent and omnipresent being. This is what we teach all the time. And so why are we having to run defense for God? I'm pretty sure he can do that himself. But also, it just feels more like a self-preservation thing rather than a proper listening to the experiences of these people. And so it can be easier just to pretend that they were never real Christians in the first place than to actually really critically examine, well, hey, how may we have borne some responsibility here? And with the latter version of that, it falls into a bit of a no true Scotsman fallacy. But the thing is, a lot of the people who do, unfortunately perpetuate things like spiritual abuse and the like, they themselves have a genuine, sincere faith, and it is horrifically misguided or abused for the sake of, trying to gain power.
I completely agree with you on so many of those points. Like, I just personally, I find it very frustrating when Christians don't try to honestly engage with a lot of the phenomena of deconversion and deconstruction, and mostly try to hand wave it away or explain it away and say, well, this, like, giving all the excuses that you just gave. And a lot of it is just to deflect blame from themselves and to not honestly look at the problem that's there. And I just don't think that helps anyone. Like, not being honest about the data, not being honest about the things that cause it. There's often like a projection onto ex-Christians saying, oh, well, like, it was just, it, like you said, it was a sin problem, or they didn't leave God, they left the people, and things like that. And it's, well, that's not really true. Like, they left the church because of a lot of reasons. Like, there's never actually, like, when I've done the research on this, there's never one reason. It's always like a complicated multitude of reasons, and things are affected by material conditions, social contexts, and so many other things that you can't, I don't know, you can't put your finger on one issue and say, well, they left because of this. And exactly. I think you and me are both very committed to making sure that we don't reproduce those biases. And I often think they're not just biases, they're like intentional defense mechanisms and things that are put in place to protect the people who are there, or to reassure people who are in the faith. Don't look at this. There's nothing to see here, because they don't want people digging in. And I don't know. I don't see a point in that. I understand why people do it. It's like a normal, natural social reaction, but I don't really have time for it. So let's get into why, now that we've put caveats and methodology aside. The first point I want to give, so we talked about surveying and all the potential issues with surveying and how it often gets incomplete data, but from the data we do have, we can see trends. But like one factor as to why autistic people answer this is what I call the self-identification problem, or the light switch problem. I call it the light switch problem because the joke kind of is autistic people, like most people are like a dial where they have a wide spectrum of different positions they hold. But autistic people are either on or off, right? They're either fully in or fully out. And that applies especially to religious belief. So when you ask an autistic person, for example, the question, do you conform to an orthodox understanding of the Christian faith, like a lowercase o orthodox, not as in the denomination, but do you hold to a traditional understanding of Christianity? I know Christians who will answer no to that because they're not sure the findings of the Council of Chalcedon are completely valid. And they're like, well, Chalcedon is generally recognized as one of the 7 ecumenical councils, and that was the one in which they said that Miaphysite Christology is invalid, and I think Coptics and the Syrian Church of the East I think they're valid Christians, so no, I don't. And it's, okay, that wasn't what we were trying to ask, but it's that light switch, right? So they look and they say, well, do I agree with this 100%? And the answer is no, so they go, okay, no. They agree with it 99%, so they would say, I agree with, so if you talk to them, you would not be able to tell. Like, you'd be like, oh yeah, this is just like a standard autistic Christian. They hold to a fairly orthodox understanding of the faith. They just think maybe the Council of Chalcedon went too far. And but they'll answer no to the question. Yeah. And you also just find fewer lukewarm autistic Christians. You never find a lot of them kind of sitting in the middle on questions about does God exist or something like that. Whereas most people, there'll be all sorts of beliefs, and usually a wide spectrum, and there'll be people who are kind of lukewarm. Maybe, but I'm not sure. But autistic people tend to be very decisive. Like they tend to either be on the fully one side or fully the other. And so when you're asking the question why, some of the reason why is probably just the autistic tendency for it. I mean, it's called black and white thinking. Like, that's typically how it's characterized. I don't think that's a proper explanation for what it is, and it kind of has negative connotations, but I think that is a one explanation. But I don't think that can account for all of the data. And I don't think that does a very good job of accounting for why exactly things are the way that they are.
Yeah.
So, when answering this question, I think we basically need to look at three different things. So the first thing we need to look at is evangelism. The second one, catechism, and the third, maintenance. So when we're asking why are autistic people less likely to be Christian, what I kind of think of it as is like a pipe or like a pipeline. If you want to know why the autistic pipeline has fewer Christians in it and the non-autistic pipeline has more Christians in it, what you need to look at is how many people are entering the pipeline, how many people are leaving the pipeline, at what points are they leaving the pipeline, and how are they leaving it. And so if we look at evangelism, that's like how people enter the pipe. And then for those who weren't evangelized into the faith, for those who were born into the faith, catechism, or how the church teaches people like children or new converts about the faith and what they need to, like what Christianity is and how it's to be understood. And then, so those are like the entries into the faith, and then maintenance. Once you're in the faith, what does Christianity do to keep you in the faith? And I think if you basically just analyze these three factors in depth, you can get a very robust answer as to why autistic people are less likely to be Christian. And for the next few episodes, that's exactly what we're going to do. Probably in more detail than you have ever wanted or ever thought was possible, but it's going to happen. I'm just going to go over a quick overview of these three, and then the next episodes will drill down into the specifics. Evangelism. Evangelism is interesting, right? Because essentially what modern evangelism is, it's basically a marketing campaign, and the product they're trying to sell you is Jesus. And like they're explicit about this. If you go to a lot of evangelism conferences, they'll be like, we are trying to sell Jesus to people. And the difficulty about campaigns and targeted marketing campaigns and things like that is that they have a target audience. So whenever you're trying to evangelize, you need to find a type of person to evangelize to. And generally speaking, what you're going to do is you are going to target the average person within a cultural group. So you pick a group that you're going to evangelize to, and then you try to find the person that most people would be able to, or like a type of person that most people would be able to fall into, or maybe a set of types of people. And evangelistic efforts, they like basically try to do three things. They try to answer questions, meet needs, and fulfill desires. And basically what they do is they take this or a set of people that they're targeting, and they try to answer the questions, the needs, and the desires of these people and give them answers, or give them Christian answers that are satisfying to them. The problem with a lot of that is autistic people ask different questions than non-autistic people. We often have very different needs, and we often have very different desires. And so a lot of the evangelism that's targeted towards autists or towards regular people just doesn't make sense to autistic people. It doesn't go after the things that they actually care about. And I mean, there are so many different things that we could go into. Like, if you just look at common evangelism tools, so like Alpha, and you look at the marketing material for Alpha, or you look at the videos for Alpha, like at one point, I basically just got as many like evangelism tools as I could and just went through the material and listed out all the questions they're answering. And then I also went through with all the autistic people that I work with and the ones that are interested in Christianity or wanting to know more about it, and listing out their questions and seeing where the overlap was. And it was like there was virtually no overlap. Like the types of things that modern evangelism is trying to answer and the types of things that autistic people want answered, just they weren't there. And so that's questions, but then there are also like needs and desires. And autistic people have specific like sensory needs. They have certain ways that they like to socialize, things that they like to do. I mean, it's like a culture in and of itself where it has all these different where autistic people have all these like different norms and ways of understanding things and ways that should be done. And evangelism events usually just aren't set up to accommodate autistic people. And one common thing that I see in a lot of these evangelism events, when I ask autistic people who have attended them what they thought about them, is they often hate them. And they're like, I feel like people are trying to emotionally manipulate me. And they get immediately suspicious of them. And they're like, I don't like this. Someone's trying to trick me. I feel like someone's trying to play a game here, and I'm not a big fan of it. And it's, yeah, I completely understand why you'd feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a common thing that comes up. So if we go back to Alpha, one of the questions that's asked in Alpha is, why are we here? What is our ultimate purpose? And what is the fundamental meaning of life? And it's an interesting question to ask, but it's an interesting question to ask. It's not a question autistic people often ask. No, that's not to say autistic people don't ask that question. I know plenty who do, but if you just look at most autistic people, a lot of them aren't really concerned with that type of thing. And like there was actually one interesting research paper that went over autistic people and teleological reasoning. So that's answering questions of meaning and significance, or attributing meaning to various events in your life. So an example, like something happens in your life that's bad, but ultimately, because that bad thing happened, something good happened. A lot of people say, well, that happened for a reason, or God was watching me and God wanted me to see this. Autistic people are far less likely to make those connections, far less likely to say, oh yeah, that was God, and more likely to say, that was weird. And that's kind of where they leave it. And I think there's a pretty good blog post by a blogger called the Aspie Priest. Aspie is short for Asperger's syndrome, and it's a term a lot of us used to use to self-identify. And I think he does a really good job of explaining this type of phenomenon.
When I moved to high school, I got good grades in most subjects, but it took a while for my English scores to catch up with other subjects. I think that's because I had to learn what kind of analysis was expected. When I watch a film or read a book, I am mostly interested in what happens next. I read quickly and turn pages to find out how the action proceeds, and should the author choose to insert a page of florid prose about the beauty of a particular landscape, my eyes will likely skip over that and seek out the continuation of the action. I don't have a very visual imagination, so characters in the story become mere labels in my head, i.e., Frodo, Hobbit, hairy feet, carries the One Ring. I don't start imagining what people or places might look like. In school English lessons, I learned to ask questions about the deeper meaning of a text, but that doesn't come to me very intuitively. If something is an obvious satire, I can recognize that. Terry Pratchett's Discworld astutely charts a world not entirely unlike our own, moving from a medieval existence to a thoroughly modern one. But unless the parallels are clearly drawn, I won't see them at first viewing. If I am asked the right questions, then yes, I can draw that out, but it requires sustained brain work, deliberately applied. It now seems to me that many people are wired to instinctively seek meaning in events. In my life, I pursued a PhD because I was interested in the subject and capable of doing it. That seemed reason enough. I didn't consciously have a God-shaped hole and wasn't asking what's the meaning of life, but God did appear in my life, and I learned that calling him Lord meant saying, "What would you like me to do?" ultimately receiving the answer that I should be a diocesan priest. Yet even now, I have a sneaking suspicion that if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have started seeking meaning in life, and purpose would have gone no deeper than pursuing what makes me happy.
I think if you look at Alpha and a lot of those sorts of evangelism courses, they try to answer those questions that sometimes autistic people just don't care about, or they try to answer them in ways that autistic people find deeply unsatisfying. Like, one thing that I found in autistic people is we really care about very specific and very boring details. Yes. And we really, like, one of the things that that happens with autistic people. We often get accused for missing the forest for the trees and, hyperfixating on small sections of things and, being very detail oriented. And that's true.
Yes.
But it's not just that, right? It's that we care about the really big, small details, but we also care about like the whole overarching picture and how all these details fit and interlock with everything else. Like we want to fully define the system.
Yeah. Like very often our fixation on those small details is because we want to find consistency within the bigger picture. It's okay, there's a bigger picture, but these smaller details might not so much contradict, but kind of trip up understanding of what the bigger picture is. And if all the small details are consistent, then we can kind of comfortably view the consistency of the bigger picture.
And if you look at most evangelism material is not, okay, sit in this chair, and for the next 10 hours, we are going to go through a systematic structural approach to understanding the ideological framework of Christianity. Now, I will say, this is probably... Yeah. Well, I will say, this is in many ways the ideal autistic evangelism experience. If you ask an autistic person what they want to hear when someone's like trying to tell them about Christianity, they're like, I want to understand it. I want to know why you believe this. I want to understand how it works, how it functions, and I want my questions answered about this. And, most people, like, they're not interested in that. Or maybe they are interested in that, but that's not what they're looking for up front. Whereas a lot of autistic people will come to it and they'll say, okay, here is my laundry list of 10,000 questions that I want answered before we move on with anything. And that a lot of people just simply aren't prepared for it. And they're often not prepared for the inner workings of the autistic mind and the questions that we tend to ask. And I've compiled a list of questions that I've had autistic people ask me, and I'm just going to go through a list of them that I've been asked by people as they were coming into Christianity. Why did Jesus have to feel physical pain? Okay, I can answer this question. It's going to take a while, though. This is not a question I can answer in an hour. Did Jesus' resurrected body have synapsing neurons? Why is Jesus' genealogy necessary if Jesus could have hypothetically been incarnated into any mother? Or at what point in evolution did we get souls? Or a lot of questions are, well, how do we know X? And often what they mean is, how can I prove this? Measure it, test it, and analyze it. And a lot of those questions are very difficult to answer, right? Because you'll say, well, just going over the Nicene Creed, and you say, well, he was born of the Virgin Mary. And they're like, well, how do you know that? You're asking me to believe this, but did anyone check? Like, how did they check? How do we know that they got it right? And it's, oh man, there are so many things I need to explain before we can even get to this. But like, this is what autistic people want when they're looking to enter Christianity. And I know that because they've told me. And a lot of autistics who are curious about Christianity, usually before they convert, they will spend like hundreds of hours watching YouTube videos, reading books, just trying to learn about Christianity before they make any move. And a lot of times evangelism just isn't there to give you those types of answers, and the people running it just aren't prepared to give you that type of answer. And again, a lot of Christians simply aren't prepared to give answers or don't understand the fundamentals and the inner workings of Christian theology in a way that allows them to answer these questions. So like one example I give, so the inspiration of Scripture is a problem that comes up a lot. And it's a problem that gets answered over and over in various different ways. But basically, the proof text that's often used for the inspiration of Scripture is, I think, in 2 Timothy. It basically says all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, preaching, correcting, and something else. Anyway, not important. for this particular anecdote, but basically what's important is that in one of Paul's letters, we have the proof text for that verse, showing the inspiration of Scripture. And one of the things that one autistic person came to me with, he was 19. I believe he was already a Christian. He was just struggling with trying to work things out. And he came to me, and he had a sheet of paper, and on it were drawn 2 timelines where he listed out all the books in the Bible in chronological order according to various different scholars. And in one timeline, Timothy was in one place, as it was written by Paul, but many scholars don't think it was written by Paul and think it was written later. And so that was in the second timeline.
Yeah.
And he came to me and he said, okay, Paul could not possibly have been referring to books that hadn't been written yet. So clearly, this verse only applies to things before this verse was written. So he went through the New Testament canon. He's like, which books are inspired and which ones aren't? Because clearly some of them aren't. And because we don't know when Timothy's written, I can't figure out which ones I need to pay attention to and which ones I don't. And it's just, it's such classic autistic reasoning. And it's just, that guy's completely right. Like he has hit the nail on the head when he has been analyzing this. And it's just like such a concrete structural way of thinking and such like a literalistic analysis way of thinking. It's pretty typical of autistic people. And I just think it's funny because it's like, that is something that would only come from us. But so when I give presentations to priests and pastors and like church groups, I ask them, like before I tell them the story, I'm like, someone came to me asking questions about the inspiration of Scripture. And particularly its relevance to 2 Timothy. And then I would ask them, what do you think his issue was? And I'd get them to give me their answers. And they would give good answers, but it's like, nope, none of them, you cannot predict what's about to hit you. And a lot of people who do evangelism just aren't prepared to deal with that. No. And they'll often dismiss the autistic person who's asking it, because a lot of times, like, just being honest about us, we can be very blunt. We can say things in a very blunt, straightforward way. We can often come off as a little bit adversarial and a little bit lawyerly debating style, like a little confrontational when we ask things. And oftentimes it's not intentional. It's just how we communicate. We're just, I want to know this answer. And then they give you an answer and you're like, that's not good enough because of reason 1, 2, and 3. And someone is like, oh no, I'm being debated. And the autistic person is like, buddy, I'm just trying to figure this out. Like, this is nothing to do with you. I'm not taking this personally, but you clearly are. And a lot of non-autistic people don't know how to respond to that. And they don't understand that what is happening is the autistic person is sincerely trying to wrestle with these issues. But because of the way that they're coming off socially, they're often just labeled as like a nuisance, or like as arrogant, or like the problem kid in the youth group or the Bible study. And often their concerns aren't treated seriously. And so if you're that autistic person and you're wanting to join the faith and your questions are being dismissed, or you're being dismissed because everyone thinks you're just being pedantic and difficult. Now, to be fair, you might be being pedantic and difficult, but I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying, like, the people communicating with them often just aren't prepared for autistic communication styles.
No.
And we talked about this thing called the double empathy problem. And the double empathy problem is basically talking about how autistic people have a very hard time understanding the internal workings and the ideas of non-autistic people. But at the same time, non-autistic people have trouble understanding the internal workings of autistic people. It's only considered an empathy deficit on the autistic side, but not on the non-autistic side. And that's not because it doesn't exist on the non-autistic side. It's just they're 99% of the population, and we're about 1% of the population.
Yeah.
But this plays a really big part in evangelism, because oftentimes evangelists aren't translating their language or translating what they're saying into autistic. And that's not saying like autistic people speak a different language. It's just the thing I try to explain is it's just like a It's like a different culture. So when I'm trying to explain this to larger groups, and I'm just trying to give like my 50-second explanation, I say, imagine in your city, for the past 100 years, there has been an ethnic minority. And this ethnic minority is far less likely to be Christian than the overwhelming majority of people in your city who are Christian. And if you ask them, why are you less likely to be Christian, or why is this minority less likely to be Christian? And you look at your evangelism material, and you haven't translated any of your material into their language. You haven't catered your material to fit within any of their own cultural norms and cultural understandings. You haven't met with people from that culture to figure out how to best talk to other people from that culture. And you haven't done any of the normal missionary work that you would normally do. And you're like, well, why is this population less likely to be autistic? And it's like, buddy, you haven't even tried. Like, you're not trying here. The only difference is that autistic people, we're not like a ethnic block. We're more distributed across the populations in various ways. And the metaphor kind of breaks down in that sense. But I think the principle is pretty much the same. A lot of people just haven't learned or bothered to learn the types of communication styles, concerns, needs, and all that for autistic people. And so when they try to share the gospel with us, they often share it in a way that we just don't understand, or in a way that we find confusing and odd or off-putting. Like, one of the things that you'll often find in Alpha and other things like that are people like talking about having a personal relationship with the creator of the universe. And autistic people are like, that doesn't make any sense. I can't see them. I can't touch them. They can't touch me. I can't talk to them. They can't talk to me. How am I supposed to have a personal relationship with something I can't touch, see, feel, or measure? Because my only conception of personal relationships is with like physical entities. And if the main
navigating that.
Yeah, and exactly. And it's like, personal relationships. Oh, that thing autistic people are really good at. Like, and it's just like, this isn't something that naturally appeals to us. And when that's like your big draw, and that's your big pitch for coming into Christianity, it would be like going to Iceland and trying to pitch them on Australian rules football. It's like, culturally, there are a lot of things going on. Maybe you should try pitching a sport that they're more culturally familiar with.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of thing.
It's interesting well, because autistic people, we make up about 1% of the global population, and so much of the evangelism material is done to bring in a quantity, like a vast quantity of people, and often it's geared towards the, let's say, 99% who are not autistic, and let's say up to about 85% of people who are neurotypical, because of course neurodiversity encompasses a whole range of different conditions and disabilities. And I hear that, and I can't help but think of the parable of the one sheep, where Jesus talks about how, I think it was in the book of Luke especially, how he talks about, this one sheep is not there. And so the farmer leaves behind the 99 to go find that one and bring it back to the flock and celebrates when it happens. And I think to myself, hearing this, I'm like, how opposite it is with a lot of these evangelism materials catering towards the 99. And when you point out, oh, hey, there's this one sheep that's not there, that's meant to be here, then their attitude very often is to turn around and say, yeah, but this is one sheep. Why should we just like suddenly rehaul our materials to cater to that? Yeah, and when Christ was sharing that parable, this is in a region of the world where it's dangerous and rocky terrain with a whole bunch of natural predators out there. And this shepherd risks life and limb for this one sheep. And Christ says this is exactly what the kingdom of heaven is supposed to be. And if we as Christians are supposed to be, bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, even through the limitations we have down here, surely that something as simple as that is a model we're meant to follow. And so hearing all of this and kind of being reassured that, yeah, I'm not the only one that seems to have noticed a lot of this stuff that you've just been pointing out. Because, wow, it just makes me think of how backward it is when so much is being catered and they're almost not thinking about the fact that, yeah, at least 1% is being left behind.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in a lot of cases, I think they don't even, to go off the lost sheep metaphor, I think in most cases they don't even know the sheep is lost. They are blissfully unaware that sheep isn't even in the flock. Yeah. And I would also say that a lot of churches mean well, and they want to bring in the autistic people, but they're often just like wildly unequipped to deal with it, right? They don't understand what they're supposed to do. When they do it wrong. And so even a lot of times they try, but they just like wildly miss. And it's like, yeah, that's fair. But the reason that you wildly missed is because you didn't take time to understand the culture of this group that you're trying to evangelize. And you took your own understanding of Christianity. And a lot of times there's this tendency to say the way I practice Christianity is the right way. And you tried to sell wings to a fish, which in most cases isn't a particularly useful thing. Another thing that I've noticed, autistic people, there's almost like a default naturalism or like methodological naturalism to their thinking. They're very like rigid, structured, systematic. I think in the autistic community, you find a lot of, I guess, scientism, or I don't know if that's the right term for it, but very much the way I know things is by testing them, analyzing them. And oftentimes we're socialized to develop a pretty strong sense of skepticism. And I think it's often because, and we'll talk about this in later episodes, I think it's often because so much of the time growing up, our intuitions fail us. Like what we think should be the case turns out to not be the case. And so as an autistic person, you spend a disproportionate amount of time questioning your own intuitions and questioning everything, like, is what I'm perceiving actually reality? Or have I made a mistake in this way? And I think that develops a sort of resistance to these types of things. But even then, a lot of times this like skepticism and this naturalism comes into like loggerheads with a very rigid theology and doctrine. So for example, most autistic people that I know, and most autistic people that I went to university with and met in university groups, are like fully on board with evolution, and not in the sense like they learned about it in science class once, but in the sense that they've actually spent a lot of time thinking about evolution and things like that.
Yeah.
And then they go to a campus church group, and the church group says, we don't, like, evolution's a lie or something like that. And they go, what are you talking about? Are you insane? And a lot of autistic people will push back, and then the people evangelizing will go into a sort of like defensive apologetics mode, and they'll try to fight them, or they'll try to use rhetoric tricks or a whole bunch of things like this that just generally don't work on us very well.
No.
And there's a lot of like appeals to authority and things like that. It's like, man, I do not care about what some smart person thinks. This is not something I care about at all. And so a lot of times when autistic people are at evangelism events or talking to people trying to spread the Christian faith, the autistic person will naturally just start testing the boundaries and figuring out the ideology. And then they'll start asking questions that are a little too hard. And then the person evangelizing to them gets very defensive. There are also just other, I'll call them logistical issues. Like a huge thing that a lot of autistic people talk to me about are sensory issues. If you look at most places where evangelism takes place, there's like loud music, weird noises, lots of background chatter, usually lots of people in a group. If you think of a lot of young adults events or like events meant to draw in college students, like if you're autistic, it's an unfamiliar social setting. There are lots of new people. There's a different standard for what you're supposed to say, do, and act. There's a whole new set of social rules, and as an autistic person, that is extremely stressful. Like, it is, I can't explain how difficult that is and how like nerve-wracking it is to go into a new social situation and not know the rules. And you often like I I was in the army, and one of the things that I did in my army officer training is we do a field phase, and that's where you like basically dig trenches and get gassed, and you are sleep deprived, and it's in Canada, and so it would like rain during the day and then freeze during the night, and it was just like misery, like sheer misery for weeks on end. Yeah. And then I often say, I think back to the worst days, and I think, would I rather do that or go to a college campus outreach event? And there's a part of me, that's like, you know what? I think I'd go back to the trench. I and like, I'm not even joking. Like, think about like, we were getting like CS gassed, which is like a very concentrated form of tear gas.
Yeah.
And like my gas mask froze because water got in the bag. And so the filter was frozen. I breathed in, the gas mask like sucked to my face. So I had to take it off, but I was also like on the light machine gun for my section. And so I had to hold in the trench and lay down a fire base. And I just remember like puking, and it was horrible, and you had to stay in the trench, and it was cold and it was miserable. And then I think about some of the campus events that I've been to, and like some of the outreach events that I've been to, and I'm like, yeah, no, I'll take the trench. I'll do that again. Just at least I know that's going to end. At least I know what's expected of me in the trench. And anyway, it's a lot of these events simply aren't catered to autistic people.
Yeah, I felt awkward and out of place at a lot of these events, and yeah, sensory-wise, just overwhelming. But my God, I didn't realize. It kind of puts it in perspective as, oh dear, no, that's a problem.
Yeah, I've had some bad experiences. I'll just say that, and I'm not even close to the only one. Like, it's a super common thing that a lot of us deal with, and we'll dedicate an entire episode to like the sensory experience of church. But it's a major barrier, and like the anxiety around going into a new social situation and not knowing the rules, and it feels like you're walking on eggshells.
Yes.
And like you don't know if you're about to upset someone, and you don't know what things you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say, and it sucks. But for most people, they love this stuff, right? And this is what gets people to go to these events. A lot of the things that attract people are the same things that make it very hard for autistic people. One of the things that I found in just looking at successful evangelism attempts with autistic people is the common factor is usually very low-key, individual, one-on-one, dialogue-based conversations where the person is open and honest and willing to confront the difficult parts of the Christian experience.
Yeah.
Those are the types of things that tend to bring autistic Christians into the faith. Like, those are the types of things that tend to let us go, hey, yeah, I'll give this a shot. But yeah, the next big problem or barrier in evangelism is one that I found is particularly the church's history and reputation of dealing with issues around women and women's equality and the status of queer people in the church. And I just found that I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say, without going into any of the theology or going into whatever position you want to hold. I'm like, this isn't a podcast about that.
No.
But I think it's fair to say that the church has had a fairly negative view of women and hasn't been very good at dealing with the concerns of women, and especially has been very bad at handling LGBTQ plus issues, from either oblivious to explicitly hostile. There are multitudes of problems, and I'm sure we don't need to go into specifics, but these are often like significant barriers for entry, not just for people who are in those communities, interestingly enough, but for most autistic people. Yeah. So I will say, not every autistic person is like this, but a lot of autistic people We've grown up on the margins. We've grown up being bullied. We've grown up being excluded. And we're usually very sensitive to other people being excluded. And we're usually very egalitarian in our approaches to things. Again, not everyone. There sometimes people are just dicks, but it happens. It happens. Every community has a wide variety of people. But in general, autistic people are very focused on like egalitarian issues. And I found a lot of young men who were like, I'm not sure I want to be a Christian because Christians treat women poorly. And I don't think that's something that I'm interested in joining. And it's a young man saying that. They're not even the target of a lot of this stuff. And again, a lot of straight autistic people will have, especially if they're like, if they know they're autistic and if they're involved in the autistic community. For those of you who don't know, autistic people are disproportionately queer when you compare them to the non-autistic population. So disproportionately trans, disproportionately gay, disproportionately lesbian, bi, and asexual. And if you aren't in that group, you probably know someone who is in that group. And they're probably someone you like and someone you care about. And so a lot of churches really aren't good at addressing these issues. And just basic things. I've talked to a lot of churches and done a few talks where, especially nowadays, asked about how do I reach out to this trans person who used to be a member of our congregation who's left. And they don't get they'll say they're a trans man when really they're a trans woman. And they don't understand the terminology so much that they call them the wrong thing. And it's like, if you're trying to deal with autistic people who are usually pretty plugged into these communities and who are pretty sensitive to issues around justice, like, this does not make them feel like this is a safe place or this is a movement that they want to join or a movement that they want to be associated with. I mean, just personally, I find it pretty embarrassing to hear a lot of that stuff coming from fellow Christians, because I'm like, you're just using all of the wrong sorts of words and terms that it just shows you haven't cared enough to listen to these people. And now you're trying to evangelize to people. Like, this isn't a good look. But yeah, like, again, feel however you want about the theology. Like, if you are, so I know a lot of denominations are not affirming, and I'm not saying, like, in order to attract autistic people, you need to be affirming, but I've found, just in general, most autistic people who do convert will convert to an explicitly affirming denomination, and usually a denomination that allows for women's ordination. Again, not all of us, but those are usually two issues that we care a lot about, and a lot of times churches don't handle those with the appropriate care and sensitivity that they need to, and that often is a barrier to us because we don't want to be associated with that, right?
I think speaking to someone who obviously is a Christian autistic woman and who is quite, again, well connected with a lot of members of the queer community because of being quite well connected within my local autistic community, these are things that have cropped up for me. And part of the problem is, and again, hold the theology you want to hold, fine. But a lot of the times, and this kind of goes back to that whole evangelism and catechism sort of side of things where there's this rigid apologetics. It's rather ironic that autistic people are often portrayed as being cognitively rigid. And it's true. We do get to that, especially if we're not coping very well in a situation. But we seem to be the least satisfied with rigidly apologetic answers to our questions. Now, I must state that I actually grew up, the church that I grew up in actually was led by a woman. But that's not to say that a woman being in charge of a church is necessarily going to make things more just for women. It was basically the equivalent of Eric Andre asking Scary Spice, did you think that Margaret Thatcher had girl power? This was still I look back on it, it was still very an explicitly patriarchal structure. It just happened to have a woman in a pantsuit rather than a man in a suit running the show. But that was it. It was literally just patriarchy with a woman running it. And I think this is part of the reason why I've always been able to understand that, patriarchal structure does not necessarily always mean that it's the men running it. It's just a system that's run to favor toxic hierarchies that are supposed to elevate men above women. And so for me, women being ordained is not so much enough for me to be satisfied that women are going to be treated as full equal people within a congregation. And I'd say it's a similar thing with regards to queer people. I'm not here to chase a sort of commercialized version of support where it's just rainbows and pink parades. It's, well, how are we going to address the issues that deeply affect queer people, such as poverty, such as abuse, such as discrimination, and the like? Like, how are we actually going to do that? And so, and it's kind of, and I know anyone listening to this would think it's rather odd for me, because I am part of a denomination that is not known to be affirming it, and we do not have women's ordination. We've had at least 3 popes now state that any woman in the Catholic Church who gets ordained is auto-excommunicated. And look, I try to square that myself. There is a little cognitive dissonance there, I do acknowledge, but I do know that as a young woman in the Catholic Church, I know that the treatment that I get within that is far better than even the church I grew up in, which happened to be run by a woman. Other women were a threat to her, and that was something that was obvious. And so it's, I didn't really get any of the kind of treatment I would have gotten had I stayed in that sort of place. That's not to say I'm satisfied with the way things are, absolutely not. I think I'm kind of, a lot of autistic people of faith who are in denominations that don't necessarily square with 100% of every single thing we believe in, we're kind of okay with being a bit of a not so much a nuisance, but definitely a thorn in the side of those who want to be comfortable with the status quo. I very much, for example, take a position of fighting for greater change within the Catholic Church. Why? Because most Christians who fight for change within the wider body of Christianity, I believe in it, I love it, and I can see the good that it has and the good that it can do. And unlike a lot of other denominations that uphold some similar principles to the Catholic Church, I found that I can actually voice that. And I'm very blessed that I am in a particular diocese that allows room for that. We just recently had a synod, and we really got to have these questions hashed out. And it was in a way that wasn't dismissive or anything of the sort. And I think a lot of churches could stand to learn to be more comfortable with uncomfortable questions being vocalized and hashed out within their own spaces. It doesn't have to mean a complete radical overhaul of every single thing that's ever been done. I think that there's a bit of a fear there, but it can in fact bring about a sort of a reinvigoration that can often be needed. I find it ironic that a lot of these churches that are calling for revival balk at someone like an autistic person bringing in questions that could be the very key to bring that about.
Yeah, and so I think what you touched on there is really important. One of the things that I often tell people is you don't need to hold any specific set of theologies you don't want to hold, but you need to be open and honest about it, and you need to. Often autistic people will be happy if they're just given the ability to have a wide breadth of range of options, or a potential range of options, or nuance within maybe a complicated situation. And it's autistic people are fine with complexity and difficulty and making trade-offs here and there. what we're often not good with is the sort of my way or the highway approach to these types of issues that a lot of times you'll find in a lot of denominations, where it's, this is the position that we will hold with respect to queer people, and if you don't hold it, then you can't be a Christian. And there isn't that kind of room for leeway or any other position. It's, no, you need to hold to this exact thing. One of the stories that I recently heard was an autistic person saying that they stopped attending the church group on their local campus because the church group decided that they were going to impose a rule that you weren't allowed to refer to a person in the group who had recently come out as transgender. They said you're not allowed to refer to them by their preferred pronouns or their new chosen name. To love them, we need to call them by their dead name and use their pronouns assigned at birth. And the autistic person was saying to me, look, I'm open to conversations about whether being transgender fits into Christianity or how it fits into Christianity. I'm open to all these things, but what I'm not open to is just abject cruelty. And this seems like you are mandating cruelty, and I'm just not going to be a part of it. And so if the group would have said, look, we have this certain ontological category of gender, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to openly discuss it, and we're going to allow for there to be nuance and allow for there to be disagreement and allow for there to be complexity, they probably would have stayed. But what they were told instead is, no, this is the way we are going to approach these issues, and we're not going to hear any of that, that leeway that you had talked about, or that just openness to discussing that you talked about, that I often find is super important. Yeah, so I think we hit that with a hammer many times, and probably don't need to go through it more. Oh, yeah. So let's move on to catechism. And a lot of the issues you get with evangelism that we talked about are going to also apply to catechism. And there are really two main problems that I find consistently for autistic people in catechism. So all the same things of catechism being developed for the average person and not being developed specifically for the ideas, concerns, and needs of autistic people. And so there is no autistic catechism. There's just the catechism that you do in most churches, right? And so whether it's the Catholic Church or whether it's the Baptist Church, whatever your formation is called, a lot of churches will have culturally relevant catechisms where they ask specific questions and answer specific things that are relevant to that time and culture. And it just so happens that there isn't one for autistics. Maybe someone can build that someday. But so you get a lot of the same problems of catechism teaching you answers to questions that you don't care about and not answering questions that you do care about. But there are also just a lot of the attitude is learn the facts, don't ask questions, or you're allowed to ask questions, but autistic people take that on face value and are like, okay, great, I can ask questions. But usually what is actually meant is you're allowed to ask questions, but only so long as you come to the right answers. So we allow you to ask questions so long as you get to the right place in the end.
Agenda-driven. It's very agenda-driven. And it's so funny because people, they will often accuse even little kids of doing this, of if you ask these questions and don't come to the conclusions we want you to come to, you're the one with the agenda. That was something that always bugged me since childhood.
Yeah. And that happens all the time. One of the most frequent experiences that autistic people will tell me, especially ex-Christians, is that during their formation, they were constantly asking questions and they were shamed for asking those questions or told, okay, you need to stop. And I've had that happen to me. I'm sure you've had that happen to you.
Yeah.
It's like a universal experience for us where we're always kind of that, I guess, often the autistic person is the problem child in the group where they're not compliant and they're constantly asking things that, awkward questions that the teacher doesn't quite know how to answer. And then the autistic person doesn't get the satisfying answer they want. and not kind of understanding that the person is uncomfortable. They just keep drilling and hammering over and over until they get what they want, and then they never get what they want, and they get really frustrated. And so there's like that. There's that aspect of the transmission of data, but there's also another aspect, which is just socialization issues. So, very frequent thing, especially for younger autistics, and especially in preteens and teens, is a lot of them will get bullied in church and ostracized and picked on. And that leads them to not exactly be motivated to carry on and continue in Christianity. If your experience of youth group is people being really mean to you and people excluding you, you're far less likely to think back on Christianity with positive memories and think, is this something that I should give more time to? And it's, these were some of my worst bullies. No, I'm not going to give them any time. It's fair enough. I understand where you're coming from there. And again, just oftentimes you will be given one set of rules communicated to you, but those rules aren't actually the rules. There's a hidden subtext to many of the rules, and autistic people often don't understand that. And so they'll go by rules as written, not rules as intended. And that often leads to autistic people coming into conflict with the group and not realizing why they're coming into conflict, and just generally having a overall bad and dissonant experience with Christianity. And the next thing is maintenance, right? So we talked about evangelism and catechism, but once you're in the church, what now? And that is a really complicated question to answer. And it's one we're probably going to spend the next few episodes trying to answer. And instead of asking, why do autistic people stay? I found that like the reasons for autistic people staying are so varied and diverse that it's very hard to classify. But instead asking the question, why do autistic people leave? So not just looking at what do churches do successfully to keep autistic people in? And we'll definitely talk about that. Yeah. But I think answering the question, what do churches fail to do? Or what sorts of things cause autistic people to leave is actually the better question to look at for answering the broader overall question. Why are autistic people less likely to be Christian? So that's what we're going to try to answer in the next few episodes. We're going to try drill down really deep into it. And the overarching theme, if I had to give one like bite-sized answer to this, why do autistic people leave the church? It is what I call the cognitive dissonance pressure cooker. So, cognitive dissonance. You mentioned it a little bit, Amy, but maybe we'll give a more of a formal definition, I guess. Well, this isn't a formal definition, it's more of an informal. But basically, cognitive dissonance is when you have two conflicting ideas, thoughts, or conceptions of reality that can't be held together. So, like, an example of this is when you're a child, you're told Santa's real, and then you catch your mother, like, going out and labeling the presents from Santa and putting them under the tree. You will experience cognitive dissonance because you have this idea that the person who put the gifts under the tree is Santa, and now you, as a child, are experiencing a different reality, one that conflicts with your current operating conception of reality, and this causes physical discomfort. And that's a pretty trivial example, but there are lots of examples of cognitive dissonance. So one that I felt really strongly from my early deconversion experience was evolution. So I was raised in a church where we believed in like a 6-day young earth creationism. And I was prepared with all the apologetics and all the answers to prove why the earth was 6,000 years old. Like I knew all the answers to all the questions. And in my mind, reality clearly showed that young earth creationism was true. But then I went to college I didn't even take a course on evolution. I was just meeting lots of people who accepted it, and I was like, well, obviously I'm missing something because these are very intelligent people who believe the wrong thing. So maybe I'll just look into it and I'll research it to figure out why they believe the way that they believe so that I can convince them how they're wrong. Um, and I went into it and I started learning all of these things, particularly about genetics and genome sequencing and DNA and all these things that point to evolution. And I had these two things in my head. One was that the Bible's true, Christianity's true, everything taught in the Bible is perfect and inerrant, and this one interpretation of Genesis is the only interpretation that you can reasonably hold, and that evolution cannot be true because one, it self-evidently isn't as shown by science, and two, because if it was, it would mean the entire Bible is false. And then, so that was one idea, and the other idea was, oh man, there's actually pretty substantial and convincing evidence of evolution via common descent. Yeah. And I went, and like that was not a fun time to live through. Like that hurt, like physically hurt. It was an incredibly uncomfortable experience. And so that's just one example of cognitive dissonance. And there are thousands of different. Like the thing is, everyone lives with cognitive dissonance, right? No one is free of cognitive dissonance. Everyone will hold conflicting views of things that conflict with reality, and they simply live with it. And even autistic people, it's a coping mechanism, really.
Yeah,
but but like it does actually cause discomfort, and everyone has like a different level of tolerance for cognitive dissonance, right? Some people can tolerate a lot of it. So for some people, the discomfort that they feel isn't very significant, or they're mentally able to cope with a lot of discomfort from cognitive dissonance, and they can live in that state without much issue. Some people, on the other hand, can't. And I find that autistic people, particularly, are very sensitive to cognitive dissonance, and they really can't live with a lot of it for very long. I also found that the things that causes cognitive dissonance, things that cause most people cognitive dissonance, will cause us significantly more. So two people experiencing the same thing, an autistic person will generally feel significantly more cognitive dissonance, just because we're usually a lot more sensitive to these types of things. And it's just the way our brains work. And we hyperfixate, and we have a lot of things that people like obsessive tendencies to try to resolve these things, and like overall systematic, structured ways of viewing the world. And we build these like elaborate mechanisms to try to navigate a world that wasn't built for us, that are very intricate and like very dependent on all these things working together. And when they don't, it causes us significantly more difficulty. So I not only do I find that autistic people can deal with less cognitive dissonance, but the things that do cause cognitive dissonance cause more cognitive dissonance. And finally, the third factor is autistic people have significantly more opportunities, I'll say, to feel cognitive dissonance in the church. So there are many things that autistic people will struggle with in the church that most people won't. I don't think there's anything that's solely unique to autistic people. No. I just think that, autistic people will have, in general, significantly more opportunities to encounter these events that cause cognitive dissonance, just because we are different and we're navigating a world that wasn't built for us in a religion that is primarily doesn't have us in mind. And so you basically get this perfect storm of cognitive dissonance. Like the three main categories that I found that cause cognitive dissonance, just from listening to deconversion stories and Christians struggling, or autistic Christians struggling with Christianity, one of the primary drivers is doctrine and ideology. So basically, the church teaches something, and I no longer think that something is true, or I think the reality is more complicated than I'm allowed to believe. The second driver for cognitive dissonance is the experience of church, just like the physical, sensory, social, and emotional experience of church.
Yeah.
And then the final driver of cognitive dissonance is overt hostility, a lack of inclusion, and a lack of accommodation. And these are going to be the topics for the next episode, where we're going to dive very deep into all these things, again, in more detail than you probably want. So I think that's a good place to leave this episode. But yeah, so we've tried to explain why autistic people are less likely to be Christian. And I think when you look at evangelism, catechism, and maintenance as a whole, it paints a pretty clear picture of why we're less likely to be Christian. And when you break it down, it's not really much of a mystery, you know?
I think it's been very enlightening to look at, because I think many of us in the autistic community who've engaged with Christianity in some aspect or another have long suspected this. And I think it's going to be interesting going even deeper into these other topics, especially with the cognitive dissonance as we go forward. I hope as well that for anyone who does ministry and work within church spaces, I hope you go into this with understanding that, and we've laid this out before, but a lot of this discussion is in a place of love, both for our autistic community and our Christian communities, but especially for those Christian autistic people. I think it's so important to, as you dive more into this podcast, that we understand this is not to attack, this is not to dismiss anyone's theology. As we've acknowledged earlier, people can have the theology that they have, but it's important to understand, to make space for those of us who might struggle, and be it with the theology, the doctrine, or the church culture, and just to evaluate and look at how do we best serve the autistic community, not with any kind of agenda for bumping up numbers, but to be, as Christ said, to be his hands and feet on earth, to basically be caring, to show love, and it is important when showing love is to show love in the way that best serves the people you wish to show that love to, not in the way that you think is right or the only way. So yeah, I'm looking forward to diving deeper.
Awesome. I think that's a great note to sign off on. Thank you for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you're interested in contacting me, you can find me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com or Twitter @ChristianityOn. You can find Amy at It Began in the 90s. It's 90 with a 90, also on Twitter. We'll be doing some Q&A episodes after the main podcast is finished. If you have any questions about my research, you can email me or send me a message on Twitter with your questions, and I will get to addressing them during that Q&A. If you want to do a live Q&A, schedule a talk or a presentation about my research for your church small group, or just as an individual person, you can find me at all the places I've already mentioned. If you'd like to join a Discord of like-minded autistics, please send me a message at one of the above listed places, and I will send you an invitation link. Thank you.